At 7 in the morning, the kitchen still belongs to shadows. The city outside my window has not fully committed to being awake yet. Somewhere down the street, a delivery truck coughs into motion. A dog offers one half-hearted bark to the day and decides that is enough effort for now. The radiator ticks softly behind the wall like an old clock remembering its duties. I stand barefoot in the kitchen and reach for a mug. Then another. The movement happens before thought arrives. One cup, then two. For a moment, my hands continue a ritual that no longer belongs to this house. The second mug is white with a small crack near the handle. It survived 3 apartments, 2 cities, and 1 relationship that was supposed to last longer than it did. I set it beside mine and only then notice what I have done. The kitchen falls very quiet. The second cup waits, empty. So do I. Years ago, this hour belonged to someone else as much as it belonged to me. There was always another chair pulled out from the table, another spoon, another opinion about whether the coffee was too strong or not strong enough. Love, I thought then, was built from these small accommodations. A little less sugar for myself, a little more patience, a little more flexibility, a little more giving. I became very good at giving, good enough that people often mistook it for happiness. Maybe I did too. I pour hot water into my mug and watch steam rise toward the ceiling. The second cup remains untouched, an empty vessel waiting for someone who is not coming. The sight of it should feel sad. Strangely, it doesn't. It feels familiar. That is worse, because familiarity has a way of disguising itself as truth. For years, I believed love meant constantly pouring myself into another person's life. Their needs became important. Their worries became urgent. Their dreams became shared property. I learned their favorite meals, their childhood stories, their fears, the shape of their silences. I learned how to anticipate disappointment before it arrived, how to smooth conflict before it hardened, how to make myself useful enough to deserve a place in someone else's world. Useful, what a dangerous word. The kettle clicks softly behind me. I sit at the table and wrap both hands around the mug. The warmth settles into my palms. Outside, morning stretches itself across rooftops. Inside, memory pulls up a chair. I remember a winter evening years ago. Snow pressed against the windows like folded paper. My phone lay on the table between dinner plates. I checked it every few minutes, not because I had important news to receive, not because there was an emergency. I was waiting for a message, one message from one person, the kind of waiting that turns time into a slow leak, the kind that makes every vibration feel like destiny. I remember reheating my food twice. I remember inventing excuses for the silence. They're busy. They're tired. They'll answer soon. I remember defending someone's absence with more loyalty than I ever showed my own loneliness. The message finally came. 3 words. Nothing extraordinary, nothing cruel, nothing beautiful either. Yet the relief that flooded my chest felt enormous, as though my worth had been briefly restored, as though existence itself had received approval. I see that version of myself now and want to reach across time, not to criticize him, not to rescue him, only to ask a question he never thought to ask himself. Why are you so hungry? Not for affection, not for companionship, for permission to believe you matter. The coffee cools, the steam disappears, the second cup remains empty, and suddenly I understand why it bothers me. The cup isn't waiting for another person. It is waiting for me. For years, I treated myself like the last guest invited to my own life. Everyone else ate first. Everyone else received the better chair. Everyone else got the benefit of patience. Meanwhile, I lived on leftovers, leftover energy, leftover attention, leftover kindness. I told myself this was generosity. But generosity and abandonment can wear remarkably similar clothes. The difference is difficult to spot when you're lonely. I glance toward the sink. A dish towel hangs from the oven handle. A small basil plant sits on the windowsill, leaning toward the weak morning light. The refrigerator hums its steady mechanical prayer. Everything in this room understands balance better than I did. The plant cannot survive by giving away all its water. The kettle cannot pour what it doesn't contain. Even the battery in my phone eventually demands to be recharged. Yet somehow I believed the heart should operate differently. I believed exhaustion was proof of love. I believed sacrifice was proof of devotion. I believed depletion was noble. And maybe sometimes it is, but not when it becomes permanent, not when giving becomes a substitute for being known, not when love becomes a transaction with your own worth. I stand and carry the second mug back to the cabinet. The shelf accepts it without commentary. The simple act feels strangely ceremonial, like returning a library book years overdue, like setting down luggage after carrying it so long you forgot it wasn't part of your body. The kitchen immediately looks more honest. One chair, one mug, one person, no performance required. The morning light strengthens. Dust drifts through it like tiny planets. I think about all the ways we try to earn what should never require earning. We become agreeable, useful, available, indispensably. We answer messages while exhausted. We apologize for needs we haven't even spoken aloud. We shape ourselves around someone else's comfort until we can no longer remember our original outline. Then one day we wake up thirsty, confused, resentful, wondering why love feels heavy, wondering why giving feels like disappearing. The answer arrives quietly, not as accusation, as recognition. You cannot pour from an empty cup. The sentence is simple enough to fit on a sticky note, simple enough to print on a greeting card, simple enough to ignore for years. I ignored it for years because the truth hiding underneath it was harder to face. If I stopped pouring everything into other people, what would remain? Who would I be without the role of caretaker? Without rescuer? Without provider? Without proof? The question lingers in the room. The basil doesn't answer. The refrigerator doesn't answer. The morning doesn't answer. Instead, sunlight reaches the table and settles across my hands. Warm, ordinary, undemanding. For the first time, I notice how tired those hands are. Not physically, spiritually, tired of auditioning, tired of negotiating their value, tired of mistaking usefulness for love. I place one palm against my chest. The heartbeat waiting there feels familiar, patient, unimpressed by performance. It has been keeping time through every relationship, every disappointment, every hopeful beginning and reluctant ending. It stayed. I close my eyes and finally ask the question this story has been walking toward all morning. How can you love another if you don't love yourself? The answer doesn't arrive as thunder. It arrives as silence, the good kind, the kind that creates room for truth. You can't, not completely, not sustainably. You can attach, you can sacrifice, you can chase, you can rescue, you can perform, you can disappear. But love, real love, the kind that nourishes instead of consumes, it must begin closer to home, closer than another person's approval, closer than their affection, closer than their choice. It begins here, at a kitchen table, with one honest cup, one tired heart, and one small decision to stop abandoning yourself in order to be loved. The city outside is fully awake now. Cars move, doors open, the day gathers momentum. I finish my coffee and stand. The empty chair remains empty, but it no longer feels lonely. It feels available, a place reserved for the person I keep forgetting to invite, myself. Before leaving the kitchen, I touch the back of the chair gently, a promise more than a gesture. I'll save a seat for you tomorrow. The words sound strange, then surprisingly right. The morning accepts them. The basil leans further into the light. The kettle rests, and somewhere inside me, a cup I didn't realize was empty begins slowly, quietly to fill. Not the pale light that slips through curtains before dawn, uncertain of its intentions. This is the committed light, the kind that arrives knowing exactly what it plans to reveal. I stand in front of the sink with wet hands and a face still carrying traces of sleep. The mirror waits. It always does. Passion, silent, unimpressed by excuses. A small crack runs along the lower corner of the frame. I've been meaning to replace it for years. Somehow I never do, perhaps because the crack feels honest. It reminds me that even objects grow older without asking permission. I lean closer. There are new lines near my eyes, not dramatic ones. Nothing tragic, just thin rivers etched by thousands of ordinary days. Laughter, worry, concentration, loss, love, the geography of a life. I touch one lightly. The mirror does not flatter. It does not apologize. It simply returns what I offer. There was a time when I hated that about mirrors. Back then, I believed every reflection was a report card, every photograph a verdict, every glance from another person a measurement of my worth. I remember standing in front of this same mirror years ago, preparing for a date. The room smelled faintly of shaving cream and nervous optimism. I changed shirts 3 times, adjusted my hair 5, stepped back, stepped forward, turned sideways, examined myself from angles no one would ever naturally see. The mirror became a courtroom. I was both defendant and judge, too tired, too old, too ordinary, not interesting enough, not attractive enough, not enough. The sentence was always the same, not enough. Funny how easily we learn that language. No one teaches it directly. It arrives through advertisements, through comparisons, through casual remarks that linger longer than they deserve, through photographs carefully edited until reality itself begins to feel inadequate. Most of all, it arrives through repetition. A whisper repeated often enough becomes scripture. I splash water on my face. Droplets slide down the glass and briefly distort my reflection. For a moment, I disappear into movement. Then the image returns, older, softer, more familiar than I once allowed it to be. The mirror has watched every version of me, the hopeful one, the heartbroken one, the ambitious one, the exhausted one, the one who thought love was something earned through performance, and the one slowly learning otherwise. The strange thing is this: the mirror never changed its behavior. Only I did. Years ago, I would stand here before checking my phone, not because I needed the time, not because I expected important news. I was waiting for evidence, evidence that I mattered, a notification, a message, a name lighting up the screen, the tiny electronic miracle of being remembered. How many mornings began that way? Too many. I would wake and immediately search for confirmation that I existed in someone else's thoughts. If the message arrived, the day felt lighter. If it didn't, everything seemed heavier than it actually was. The weather, the work, the silence. Looking back, I realize I had quietly handed over the keys to my emotional weather system. Someone else controlled the forecast. Someone else decided whether the sun appeared. Someone else unknowingly held authority over a value that should never have left my possession. The mirror saw all of it, the waiting, the hoping, the negotiations, the tiny bargains I made with myself. If they text, I'll feel better. If they call, I'll relax. If they choose me, I'll finally believe I'm enough. The cruel part is that sometimes they did, and the relief always faded because external approval is a beautiful guest and a terrible landlord. It visits, it comforts, it leaves, then you're left searching for it again. I open the medicine cabinet. Inside sits a collection of ordinary things: toothpaste, bandage, a bottle of aspirin, nothing glamorous, nothing designed to impress strangers. Everything there exists for care, not validation. Care, the distinction feels important. For years, I confused the two. I wanted validation and called it love. I wanted reassurance and called it intimacy. I wanted proof and called it connection. But proof is hungry. No amount is ever enough. One compliment demands another. One reassurance expires. One affirmation fades. Soon you're collecting evidence instead of building a life. The mirror watches me think, or perhaps it only reflects a man standing quietly in a bathroom. The interpretation is mine. A memory surfaces unexpectedly. A party, years ago, warm lights, too many conversations happening at once. Someone touched my arm and smiled. You look great. 3 simple words. I carried them home like treasure, turned them over in my mind, replayed them, stored them carefully as if they were gold, as if they changed something fundamental, but they didn't. The compliment wasn't the problem. The problem was the weight I assigned to it. I treated approval like oxygen, necessary, life-sustaining, without realizing I had lungs of my own. The mirror never agreed with that arrangement. It never once said, yes, you are valuable today because someone noticed you. It never said, you deserve love because you impressed another human being. It never said, your worth depends on who stays. The mirror simply reflected again and again and again, waiting for me to notice what had been there all along. My face, my life, my existence, unaudited, unrated, undiminished, outside a bus size at the corner. The sound drifts through the open window. A neighbor closes a door. Somewhere a child laughs. The world continues its ordinary business. Meanwhile, I remain here, staring at the person I've spent years trying to improve into acceptability. What an exhausting project. To constantly renovate yourself for an audience that keeps changing, to chase approval from people who are often busy chasing their own, to stand in front of a mirror asking it questions it was never designed to answer. Am I enough? Am I livably? Am I worthy? The mirror cannot answer because those questions belong elsewhere, not in glass, not in photographs, not in text messages, not in another person's hands. I place both palms on the sink. The porcelain feels cool and solid beneath my skin. The reflection does the same. For a moment, we simply exist together. No corrections, no negotiations, no performance. Then a quieter realization arrives, one that takes longer to accept. Perhaps I never truly wanted to be loved. Not at first. What I wanted was evidence, evidence that I was worth loving, and those are not the same thing. Love says, I care for you. Validation says, you are acceptable. One nourishes, the other evaluates, one creates belonging. the other creates dependency. I spent years confusing the two. The mirror never did. That is why it never lied. It never exaggerated my flaws, never hid my strengths, never promised salvation. It only reflected reality and waited for me to stop arguing with it. The morning light climbs higher. The room brightens. Tiny dust particles drift through the air like slow moving stars. I notice details I usually ignore. The curve of my jaw, the tiredness leaving my eyes, the faint silver beginning to appear near my temples, proof of time, proof of living, proof of nothing I need to apologize for. I smiled, not the practiced smile used for photographs, not the one designed for social approval, the smaller one, the private one, the kind that softens the shoulders, the kind that feels like coming home. In the mirror, the man looking back smiles too. For years, I thought he was waiting to be fixed. Now I wonder if he was simply waiting to be seen, truly seen, not evaluated, not compared, not measured, seen. The phone buzzes somewhere in the apartment. I don't rush toward it. Whoever it is can wait. For once, I stay. Just another moment, just another breath, just long enough to practice something unfamiliar, looking directly at myself without asking for permission to belong. And before leaving the room, I say quietly to the reflection that has accompanied me through every version of this life, you were enough before anyone noticed. The mirror says nothing. It never has. It never needed to. The truth was already there. I was simply learning how to see it. And if you're still standing with me in this morning light, if you've ever searched a screen, a photograph, or another person's eyes, hoping to find your value reflected back, come with me a little further. There's a chair waiting beside a rainy window, an empty seat across from it, a silence I spent years fearing. Rain arrives sometime after noon, not the dramatic kind that demands attention, not thunder, not lightning, just a steady gray conversation between the sky and the roof, the kind of rain that makes the world feel smaller in a comforting way, the kind that invites memory inside. I sit by the window with a cup of tea that has already cooled past its best intentions. Across from me is an empty chair. It has been there for years. Same wood, same faded cushion, same slight wobble if you lean too far to the left. Most days I don't notice it. Today I do. Rain has a way of illuminating absences. Outside, drops gather along the glass and begin their slow descent toward the sill. Some travel alone. Others merge halfway down and become something larger than themselves. I watch them for longer than necessary. The chair across from me waits quietly, patient, like it knows something I don't, or perhaps something I've spent years avoiding. There was a time when this chair rarely sat empty. Someone used to occupy that space, not always physically, sometimes only through anticipation, a coat hanging nearby, a half-finished conversation, a message expected later, a future imagined. Funny how often we furnish our lives with people who aren't actually present. I look at the chair now and remember one particular afternoon, another rainy day, another version of myself. The phone lay face up on the table, silent. I told myself I was reading. The book remained open to the same page for nearly an hour. Every few minutes, my eyes drifted toward the screen, waiting, hoping, negotiating with silence. I wasn't waiting for information. I wasn't waiting for news. I was waiting for reassurance disguised as communication. There is a difference. At the time, I couldn't see it. Back then, I believed longing was evidence of love. The more I missed someone, the more meaningful the connection must be. The more anxious I felt, the deeper the attachment. The more unavailable they became, the more valuable their attention seemed. I built entire cathedrals out of breadcrumbs. One message, one smile, one delayed response explained away with generosity I never offered myself. Rain taps gently against the window. The chair remains still. I find myself staring at it the way people stare at old photographs. Not because they want to go back, because they want to understand. The truth arrives slowly, like rainwater finding a crack in stone. I wasn't afraid of losing them. Not entirely. I was afraid of being left alone with myself. The realization settles heavily, then softly, then honestly. For years, I confused loneliness with absence. I thought loneliness meant there wasn't another person in the room. No text message, no hand to hold, no voice saying goodnight. But loneliness has many disguises. Sometimes it arrives in crowded restaurants, sometimes in relationships, sometimes in beds shared with people who no longer know your dreams. And sometimes it sits quietly inside you while everyone else believes you're loved. I know because I've met that loneliness. We spent years together. The rain thickens. A bus passes outside, sending water fanning across the street. The sound rises and disappears. The chair says nothing. Its silence feels intentional. I think about all the relationships I tried to save long after they had stopped nourishing either person involved. Not because they were healthy, not because they were beautiful, because they prevented me from sitting alone in rooms like this one. Because as long as someone remained attached to my story, I didn't have to ask whether I was attached to myself. There is a peculiar kind of panic that appears when a relationship ends, not grief, not exactly something older, a fear that predates romance, a fear that whispers, now what? Now who are you? Now who witnesses your life? I remember evenings after one particular breakup, the apartment felt larger. Every room seemed to echo. I left the television running for company, not because I cared about the programs. I cared about the noise, the illusion of presence, the counterfeit version of companionship. I filled silence the way some people fill shopping carts, desperately, without asking whether I actually needed what I was collecting. One evening, I sat exactly where I am now. The rain looked much like today's rain. The chair across from me sat equally empty. I remember feeling abandoned, completely, utterly certain that something precious had been taken from me. Years later, I see the scene differently. The person who left wasn't the only absence in that room. I was missing too. Somewhere along the way, I had left myself behind, abandoned my own company, neglected my own friendship, forgotten how to sit quietly with the person who had remained through every chapter. Me, the rain softens. The window fogs slightly near the edges. I stand and wipe a small circle clear with my sleeve. The street sharpens into focus. A woman walks by holding an umbrella too small for her ambitions. A child jumps enthusiastically into a puddle. A cyclist negotiates weather and optimism simultaneously. Life continues, not because loneliness disappears, because life never waits for certainty. I return to my chair. The empty one across from me looks different now, less like evidence, more like possibility. Maybe that is what healing often is, not replacing one thing with another, changing the meaning. The chair once represented abandonment. Now it feels like an invitation, a seat reserved for a conversation I never learned how to have. The conversation with myself. I smile at the thought, awkwardly, the way you smile at a stranger who might become a friend. There was a time when being alone felt like failure, as though solitude were proof that I had somehow missed the instructions everyone else received. But age teaches unusual lessons. One of them is this: Being alone and being abandoned are not the same thing. The first is a circumstance. The second is a decision, and sometimes we are the ones making it. I abandoned myself every time I ignored my needs to secure someone else's approval. Every time I stayed silent to avoid conflict. Every time I accepted less than I deserved because loneliness seemed scarier than disappointment. Every time I chose attachment over honesty. The chair knows all of this. Or perhaps I simply project wisdom onto furniture when the rain lasts long enough. Either way, the lesson remains. Outside, the clouds begin to thin. A faint brightness appears behind them. Not sunlight exactly, a promise of sunlight, the kind of promise that asks for patience. I think of all the years I spent trying to fill empty spaces, relationships, schedules, conversation, notifications, noise, anything to avoid the terrifying possibility that my own company might not be enough. What a tragedy. To spend so much energy searching for home in other people while ignoring the person carrying the keys. The tea is cold now. I drink it anyway. The bitterness feels appropriate, not unpleasant, just honest, like truth often is. The chair across from me remains empty, yet the room no longer feels incomplete. The rain has almost stopped. Droplets cling to the glass like tiny unfinished thoughts. I place a hand on the table between us. The wood is warm, where sunlight finally begins to arrive. And in that small warmth, another understanding settles quietly into place. Loneliness is not always the absence of another. Sometimes it is the absence of yourself. The sentence lands gently, like a coat being hung up after a long journey. No drama, no revelation, just recognition. I have spent years searching for people to stay. Perhaps the deeper task was learning to stay too, to remain present, to remain kind, to remain loyal to my own life. The room brightens, the rain withdraws. Somewhere in the distance, a bird decides the storm has officially ended. I look once more at the empty chair, then nod, a greeting, a thank you, a promise. Tomorrow, if the rain returns, I'll sit here again, not to wait for someone, not to mourn someone, simply to keep company with the person who never actually left. And if you're still sitting beside me by this window, if you've ever mistaken attachment for belonging or silence for proof that you're unlovable, come with me a little farther. The garden is waiting. There is a plant whose roots have grown too tight for its pot. There is dirt beneath the fingernails. There is something about letting go that looks remarkably like learning to grow. No grand arch, no fountains, no magazine-worthy symmetry. Just a narrow strip of earth, a few stubborn herbs, two tomato plants negotiating with the season, and a wooden fence that leans slightly to the left as though listening for gossip. The rain from yesterday still lingers in the soil. When I step outside, the air smells like wet leaves and second chances. The kind of smell that reminds you the earth is constantly forgiving itself. I carry a clay pot under one arm. Inside it grows a basil plant that has become too large for the life I've given it. Its leaves crowd one another. Its stems compete for sunlight. Roots press tightly against the walls of the container, circling themselves in endless loops. A living thing trapped by the place that once helped it grow. I kneel beside the garden bed. The ground receives my weight without complaint. For a moment, I simply sit there, hands resting on my knees, watching the basil sway in a breeze too gentle to deserve a name. Then a thought arrives, not suddenly, not dramatically, the way most truths arrive, quiet enough to be ignored, loud enough to stay. I've looked like this before, not physically, emotionally, root bound, crowded, stuck, growing smaller inside a place that no longer fit. The garden has always been better at honesty than people. Plans don't pretend. They don't stay healthy to protect your feelings. They don't perform happiness. When something is wrong, they show you yellow leaves, wilted stems, roots searching desperately for room. Humans are more complicated. We can spend years convincing ourselves we're thriving while our spirit slowly runs out of space. I tip the basil gently from its pot. The soil releases with a soft sigh. For a moment, the entire root system is exposed, white threads twisting around themselves, circling, 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 trying to grow but finding only more of themselves. The sight catches me unexpectedly because I know those roots. I've lived those roots. There was a relationship once, though perhaps relationship is too generous a word. A connection, an attachment, a long season of hoping. We existed in that uncertain territory between almost and never, too close to let go, too far apart to truly arrive. I remember how much effort it required, the texts I sent first, the conversations I revived, the excuses I invented, the patience I offered, the understanding I extended, the emotional acrobatics I performed simply to keep something alive that was already quietly dying. At the time, I called it love. Now I call it fear. Fear wearing love's clothing, fear borrowing love's vocabulary, fear asking to be mistaken for devotion. The basil rests in my palms. Its roots tremble slightly in the breeze, or maybe that trembling belongs to me. I loosen the outer ring carefully with my fingers. The roots resist, not because they're healthy, because they've become accustomed to confinement. There's a difference. And suddenly I think of all the times I stayed where I wasn't growing, not because I was happy, because I was familiar. People often confuse those two. Familiarity can feel remarkably similar to safety, even when it hurts, especially when it hurts predictably. I remember waiting for messages that rarely came, accepting affection that arrived in fractions, celebrating crumbs because I was afraid to admit I was starving. Every small gesture felt enormous because I had reduced my expectations to survive the disappointment. How strange to ask so little from someone and still feel guilty for needing more. A bee drifts lazily between the lavender. The garden hums with its usual quiet industry. Somewhere beyond the fence, a dog barks at something invisible. The world continues being itself. Meanwhile, I sit in the dirt holding a basil plant and thinking about all the ways we mistake persistence for love. We keep calling, keep waiting, keep hoping, keep reaching. We believe effort guarantees outcome, that if we love enough, explain enough, sacrifice enough, remain patient enough, eventually someone will meet us where we are. But gardens don't work that way, and neither do hearts. Some things flourish, some things don't. No amount of reaching changes what isn't reaching back. The realization settles into me like rainwater into soil. Slowly, completely, I begin digging a new hole. The earth parts easily, dark and rich beneath the surface, ready, waiting, not because the basil earned it, because it needs it. What a revolutionary idea to receive space simply because growth requires space, not because you've suffered enough, not because you've proven your value, not because you've waited patiently, just because living things need room to become themselves. I lower the plant into its new home. The roots spread naturally now, no longer forced to circle, no longer trapped by yesterday's container. I add soil around the base, firm, gentle, certain, The way I wish I had learned to treat myself years ago, a memory surfaces. The final conversation, or at least the final important one, the words themselves have faded. Memory is kind that way. It removes details and preserves lessons. But I remember the feeling, the exhausting weight of trying to convince someone to choose what they clearly did not want. I remember leaving that conversation with an unfamiliar grief, not because I had lost them, because I had finally lost the fantasy that one more effort might change everything, the fantasy that love could be negotiated, the fantasy that my worth depended on being chosen. For a long time, I thought heartbreak came from losing another person. Now I think much of heartbreak comes from losing the future we invented around them. The imagined mornings, the imagined conversations, the imagined version of ourselves that existed only if they stayed. The watering can waits nearby. I lift it and pour slowly. Water darkens the soil. The basil drinks without hesitation. No apology, no performance. No need to justify its thirst. I envy that. Humans spend years apologizing for needs that plants express effortlessly: need for light, need for nourishment, need for room, need for care. The leaves lift slightly. The change is almost invisible, yet unmistakable. Something inside the plant recognizes possibility. Something inside me does too. The afternoon sun slips between clouds. Light lands across my hands, the same hands that once held on too tightly, the same hands that sent messages they shouldn't have sent, the same hands that knocked on doors already closing, the same hands that confused pursuit with love. I look at them differently now, not with shame, with tenderness. They were only trying to protect me, trying to prevent loneliness, trying to secure belonging, trying to keep something from ending. They simply didn't know that some endings are acts of mercy. The garden grows quieter. The bee has moved on. The dog has apparently solved its mystery. A breeze bends the basil gently and releases it again. I watch the movement, the freedom, the absence of struggle. And for the first time in a long while, I understand something that once felt impossible. Love is not asking, how do I make them stay? Love is asking, can I stay with myself even if they leave? The answer arrives softly, like sunlight reaching the ground after rain. Yes, not perfectly, not immediately, but yes, the ability to remain with yourself is the beginning of every healthy love story, including the one you've been postponing with your own life. I brush dirt from my palms. The soil leaves faint traces beneath my nails, evidence, proof that something was planted today, proof that something was released. I stand slowly. My knees protest briefly, then forgive me. The basil looks exactly as it did an hour ago. An entirely different growth often begins that way, invisible, quiet, uncelebrated. Before heading inside, I turn once more toward the garden, toward the plant, toward the place where a root system finally found room. And I say aloud what I wish someone had told me years ago. Some things grow only after you stop holding them. The breeze carries the sentence away. The basil keeps drinking. The afternoon keeps unfolding. And somewhere deep inside me, a hand that has spent years reaching outward finally begins learning how to open. If you're still walking with me, if you've ever stayed too long in a place that no longer allowed you to grow, if you've ever confused holding on with love, come a little farther. The day is beginning to lean toward evening. There is a shoreline waiting beyond the city. There is a sky preparing its last gold. And there is one final question we must answer. By evening, the sea has forgotten the weather. The clouds that spent all afternoon negotiating with sunlight have finally reached an agreement. Gold spills across the horizon in long, patient ribbons. The tide moves with the confidence of something that has never doubted its purpose. I leave my shoes at the edge of the sand. The beach is not crowded. A few distant figures walk their own thoughts along the shoreline. A child chases a gull and loses. A couple pauses every few steps to photograph a sunset that refuses to stay still long enough to be captured. Farther down the coast, someone sits alone on a driftwood log, facing the water as if waiting for an answer. Perhaps we all are. I step toward the tide. The first wave reaches my feet and retreats. Cold, brief, honest. The ocean has always impressed me with its refusal to perform. It never pretends to be smaller than it is, never apologizes for taking up space, never asks permission to arrive. It simply comes again and again and again. The rhythm feels familiar, almost like breathing, almost like healing. I walk where the water has just been. The sand beneath my feet is firm and dark, carrying the memory of waves that have already moved on. Each step leaves an impression. Each impression disappears. The tide collects them without ceremony. No evidence remains. No record, no proof. For years, that would have frightened me. I wanted proof. Proof that I mattered. Proof that I was loved. Proof that someone had chosen me. Proof that I was enough. What an exhausting way to live. Always gathering evidence. Always preparing a case. Always standing before an invisible jury. The sea has no interest in evidence. The sea understands something I spent years forgetting. Value does not require witnesses. The sunset deepens. Gold becomes amber. Amber becomes copper. The water gathers every color and returns none of them. I continue walking, and one by one, the symbols of this journey return. The empty cup, the mirror, the chair beside the rainy window, the basil plant. Each memory arrives like an old friend joining me for the last stretch of road. The cup taught me that I could not keep pouring from emptiness. The mirror taught me that worth and validation are not the same thing. The chair taught me that loneliness is often the absence of ourselves. The basil taught me that growth sometimes requires letting go. Together they form a map, not toward another person, toward home. I stop walking and look out across the water. The horizon holds itself with impossible calm. Somewhere beyond it are countries I will never see, people I will never meet, lives unfolding entirely without my participation. The realization feels strangely comforting, not because I am insignificant, because I am free, free from being the center of every story, free from carrying responsibility for every ending, free from trying to become someone worthy of love. The breeze lifts slightly, salt settles against my skin, the air smells like distance. And memory, I think about the question that followed me through years of relationships, the question hidden beneath every text message, every goodbye, every silence, every hope. Will someone choose me? It sounded romantic at the time. It sounded reasonable. It sounded human. But now, standing here with wet sand beneath my feet, and evening gathering around my shoulders, I hear the question differently. Not as longing, as surrender, because hidden inside it was a dangerous belief that my value depended on the answer. If they chose me, I was enough. If they stayed, I was worthy. If they loved me, I could finally rest. No wonder I was exhausted. I had handed my peace to people who never asked to carry it. The tide reaches my ankles again, then withdraws, then returns. The sea is patient with repetition. Perhaps that is why it feels wise. Healing works the same way. The lesson arrives, leaves, returns, leaves again, each time carrying a little more truth. A gull glides low across the water. For a moment, its shadow travels beside mine. Then it turns toward open sky. No apology, no hesitation, no need to justify its direction. I envy that certainty. Then I realize something. Maybe certainty isn't what I envy. Maybe it is permission. Permission to belong without earning it. Permission to exist without performing. Permission to take up space without becoming indispensable. The sky darkens another shade. The first evening star appears, small, steady, unconcerned with whether anyone notices. A laugh escapes me, soft, unexpected. I spent so many years trying to become unforgettable, as though being remembered could save me, as though being chosen could complete me, as though another person's love could build a home inside me. But homes are built differently, not through applause, not through attention, not through pursuit. A home is built through return, returning to yourself again and again and again, the same way the tide returns to shore. I stop near a cluster of rocks warmed by the day's final light. The ocean gathers around them and moves on. Nothing clings, nothing begs, nothing negotiates. The lesson feels impossible and obvious at the same time. Love was never supposed to be survival. That was the mistake. I treated relationships like oxygen, like rescue, like proof. I expected another human being to solve a loneliness that only self-abandonment had created. How could they? How can anyone carry a burden they didn't create? The answer finally arrives, not as revelation, as relief, the kind that settles into your bones after a long journey, the kind that asks nothing more than honesty. How can you love another if you don't love yourself? You can't, not fully. You can need them. You can depend on them. You can chase them. You can fear losing them. You can build your identity around them. But love, real love, love that breathes, love that nourishes, love that remains gentle when life becomes difficult, that kind of love requires something first. A relationship with yourself, a friendship with yourself, a willingness to stay. The sky is almost dark now. The gold road across the water begins to fade. I walk toward it anyway. Humans have always loved impossible roads. The beautiful thing is that I no longer need to reach the horizon. I only need to walk. I only need to remain present for the journey. The sea understands. The tide understands. Perhaps my heart understands too. For the first time in a very long while, I feel no urgency, no need to become, no need to convince, no need to prove, only gratitude. Gratitude for the person who remained through every chapter, the one who sat at the kitchen table, the one reflected in the mirror, the one waiting beside the window, the one kneeling in the garden, the one standing here now, me. The realization lands softly, like twilight, like forgiveness, like home. I close my eyes and listen. Waves, wind, distant laughter, the faithful rhythm of my own breathing. Everything I spent years searching for in other people suddenly feels much closer, not because I found someone, because I found myself. The tide reaches my feet one final time, a cool hand on the ankle, a blessing, a farewell, or perhaps a welcome. I smile toward the darkening horizon, then speak the sentence that has been waiting at the end of this journey from the very beginning, not to the sea, not to the sunset, not to anyone who left, to myself. I choose you. The words disappear into the wind, but something inside me hears them and answers at last, at home. And if you are walking this shoreline with me, if you've spent years asking whether someone else would choose you, whether someone else would stay, whether someone else would make you feel worthy, I hope you carry one thing home from this evening. You do not need to become lovable. You already are. You do not need to earn your place in your own life. You already belong. And the love you keep searching for in distant horizons may begin much closer than you think. Perhaps it begins the moment you stop asking, will someone choose me? And finally ask, can I choose myself? The sea keeps moving. The stars keep arriving. The tide keeps returning. And for the first time, so do you.